Hello and welcome to the CivilTalk Podcast. I'm your host, Tapasio Althouse. If you're new to the show, this is where we explore civility and social emotional learning with esteemed guests, expert insights, and practical advice to help people navigate the world. Today, we have a very special guest who brings a unique perspective on the science of ethical influence and persuasion, Dr. Christopher Phelps. Dr. Phelps is a highly accomplished entrepreneur, general dentist, and Amazon best-selling author. But beyond this, he is a leading expert in ethical persuasion, having trained under the renowned behavioral scientist Dr. Robert Cialdini. Now, as the U.S. CEO of the Cialdini Institute, he is helping organizations apply the science of persuasion in an ethical and impactful way. Today, we're diving into how ethical persuasion intersects with civility, emotional intelligence, and even AI. How can understanding influence help us foster more civil conversations? And how do these principles shape leadership, business, and our digital interactions? We are here to find out. Dr. Phelps, welcome to the CivilTalk Podcast.
Thank you. And wow, what a category of topics, man. Whew, this is going to be good.
I know, it's going to be a fruitful discussion. Thank you for being here. So you're a certified expert and manage a network of experts in ethical persuasion and influence which is a mouthful, from the Cialdini Institute. I'd love to hear how you got started with the Cialdini Institute and what exactly is ethical persuasion for our listeners.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting history, so to speak. This role as the CEO of the Institute for the U.S. wasn't really a job I was looking for. But now that I see that I'm in it, I realize I was probably the only one for it. So let's flash back in time many, many moons ago, many years back, probably over 10 plus years. I built 4 successful dental practices in Charlotte, North Carolina, and didn't really realize back then, because my mindset was on growth for growth's sake, just add more offices. Didn't realize that once I had reached that goal, that I had, in essence, trapped myself in my own business, and didn't realize that, doing clinical dentistry 5 days a week is great, and that's a great job. But at the same time, being CEO of the company 5 days a week and running the marketing decisions for all the 4 offices 5 days a week, as well as balancing a home life with my second son that was born, and my wife kind of needed me home more. And I realized I couldn't be there, not like I needed to, right? And so I decided I had to change my mindset, and instead of growth for growth's sake, switch to a mindset of maximize the capacity of what I had. Mm-hmm. So I decided to, as one of my mentors describes it, buy back my time, sold my 2 best offices to some partners we had at the time. And me and my original partner took over the worst offices, right? Well, when you got 3 other locations and 3 other partners, a struggling business in particular, we could consider that an investment, right? Your brain can ignore it or procrastinate on it. It's like, yeah, we see it, but it's not an immediate urgent need, right? We're going to get to it. Well, when you take over your 2 worst ones, especially one that's really bad, you can't ignore that anymore. Bad meaning it was collecting $35,000 a month in revenue, but costing us $70,000 a month in expense. So you can do that only so many months, and you realize this is not a fun check to write, right? Something's got to be done. But I really couldn't at the time put my finger on the root cause behind what I know now is the behavioral issues that were going on. Like, why weren't patients returning for treatment? Okay. Right. Why with my team? When the cat was away, the mice would play, as they say. So why is it that I have to keep telling them to do stuff? Why don't they just do it? Mm-hmm. My associate doctors, right? Why am I paying for their education, but they're not bringing that education back to serve the patients, so to speak? And again, couldn't put my finger on what was going on, why these things were happening. And if you don't know the root cause, it's kind of hard to make change, right? Mm-hmm. So I was very fortunate that a friend of mine in a business workshop seminar I was at invited me to this talk, and it was led by Dr. Robert Cialdini as the keynote speaker. And at the time, I'd never heard of him, didn't know about his pioneer book, Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion, which at that time was probably, almost 30 years old. And I just was blown away, right? And he talked about at the time his 6 principles of persuasion. And there was one of them in particular for me that was like my aha moment. I was like, oh, that one right there. That one is the root cause behind all of these issues
Right.
for patients, for my team, for my doctors. Okay, he's the expert. I got to go to the source. So I sought him out, and they do, at the time, they did a 2-day training once a year in Phoenix, Arizona. Went through that training, left with 1,000 ideas on how to solve the problems in my practices. And then I found out they had a training course, like a certification course. You could actually go deeper in your knowledge and learn from the man himself. And I thought, wow, I mean, now this is a cool opportunity. So, I mean, I put my name in the hat and I applied. I know they take, people, thousands of people applied at the time, and they rarely take anybody, but for whatever reason, they selected me. So I got to train under Dr. Cialdini for that year. And everything I learned with this behavioral science research, I was able to go back to my two struggling practices and experiment, right? And put them into practice and practice the application and try to come up with some influence-based systems for these pain points for the patients, the team, and the doctors. And the results were pretty phenomenal. Over the next 3 years, we had such rapid growth that those two offices were doing more in profitability, revenue, and my free time than when I had 4. Okay. So automatically, I saw the power of these persuasion principles in action. And probably what's even more impressive is that when did this occur? This occurred after the 2008 housing crisis, okay, when we were in a powerful economic disturbance of the force, if you will, much like what many might consider we're feeling today, okay? Inflation going up, prices rising, credit drying up, all of these other things. But yet, that was actually a time when more dental offices went bankrupt than in the history of dentistry. And yet, we're having monumental record growth, right? So it showed me that when you stop making your strategies around the excuses people give you after they tell you no, and instead you make it around what they're actually using to make the majority of their decisions, these persuasion principles, magical things can happen overnight. And so I was able to build those offices up, and then I started building dental support companies to support dentists in that industry. And then the opportunity came up to continue with Dr. Cialdini when we launched the Institute a couple of years ago. And he knows my experience with startups and turnarounds. So when he asked me to join the fray, so to speak, and help continue to build his legacy, I couldn't say no.
Right. Yeah. So what does that look like exactly? Because you mentioned, you used the tenets, I guess, of ethical persuasion for your business, and it just, grew exponentially, which is amazing. How do you apply on a tactical level those tenets? How did you do that in your business? What were a few of the strategies that you had learned in the Cialdini Institute where you're like, I'm going to implement this strategy, and how did that domino effect sort of start?
Definitely. Well, the light bulb principle for me, that root cause of all my problems, was the consistency principle. Mm-hmm. And so with consistency, I want you to think this is the commitment principle. And in essence, it states that if people commit, then they do. Well, right. Suddenly I realized, well, why aren't people doing? What was I missing? The commitment. Right. So I realized I wasn't really getting a commitment out of anyone to do anything. And then I'm the one that's shocked for not getting the result I wanted, right? So I had to go back and rethink, well, what kind of commitments am I trying to get from my patients, right? What commitments do I need them to make that influences them to want to say yes to doing some dental treatment? Because right. That was my goal with ethical influence and persuasion, is to influence patients to do something, right? Because if they do something, we both win in that scenario, okay? Right. If they choose to do nothing, though, because of our efforts, that puts them in a worse oral health state, and it's going to cost them more time, money, and pain because they waited. Plus, we didn't get the business today, so we both lose in that scenario, right? So what commitments can I get out of the patients? What commitments can I get out of my team? What commitments can I get out of my associate doctors, right? So an example with the doctors was this. In the past, I would pay for their education and then hope that they would come back and put it into practice. So instead, what I told the doctors was, I said, let's do this, guys and girls. You pick a course or topic that you find interesting, and you pay for it. You make the first commitment. Right. And tell you what, if this is a service that you could bring back that provides value to our patients that we could charge for, so to speak, then I'll go ahead and pay for any equipment you need, any supplies, any of those kinds of things, right? So I will give you all of the tools that you need to come back and put this into practice. I'll invest in that. And then I told them, and I'll do this a step further. If you show me that you actually do these procedures and put them into practice, then I will reimburse you over a period of time to pay you back for the continuing education course.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So now there's two powerful commitments these docs had to do. Number one, they had to use their own money up front. Okay, that's a powerful commitment. We call that effort, putting skin in the game, when you put time and money into something. And then number two, they had to do more effort and put it into practice. But the end result was I paid for the course, but after those commitments were made. So suddenly now I'm getting a return for that investment in the practice. I'd say with the team, it was about getting them committed to, number one, what our core values were. I think oftentimes businesses make a mistake about telling people what their core value is. Well, we don't really like to be told. And we're not really committed to something somebody told us. We'll do it when that person may be around us. That's why that adage is there: when the cat's away, the mice will play. Meaning if the cat's around, the mice will follow the commitments, the core values. But when the cat's away, because they didn't commit to it, they won't. So getting the team really committed to what it means to be excellent team members here, and then getting them involved and committed to the process of solving every problem, every new system in our practice. Okay. Getting them more involved with the process allowed us to then actually get change to happen and make more moves as a result.
Right.
And of course, with my patients, it was about getting them committed to what do they truly value? Is it how much it costs? Is that it? Is it what their insurance covers? Is it something else, right? What else do you really value when it comes to your oral health? What do you prefer? Right? Do you prefer to be reactive when it comes to your mouth and your oral health? Especially given the mouth is the gateway to the body, right? The bacteria in the mouth affect so many other organs and systems. Or do you prefer to be proactive? Someone who wants to avoid those issues happening, right? And avoid it costing you more time, money, and pain because you waited. Which would you prefer, right? So ultimately, it comes down to that: getting better commitments at everyone at every level.
Right. Yeah. Commitment is a huge one. It really enforces a relationship, a customer or a student has to whatever it is you're trying to offer, giving a sort of emotional relationship to something. So you mentioned there are other components. I think you mentioned 6 or 7 components to the ethical persuasion in the Cialdini Institute. Can you go over a few, highlight other ones that sort of stand out for you that are sort of key components of that?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, commitment is a big one. The commitment principle. Scarcity, a lot of people know scarcity, right? Is probably the one abused the most unethically against us out there.
Right.
But true scarcity is about resources, right? So if resources are dwindling or about to run out, it uber motivates you to want that thing more and do more to get it than before you knew it was about to run out. Okay. So the example I like to give is, let's say the oxygen was running out of the room in the room you're sitting in right now, hearing this and listening to this. Most of you would probably prefer to know that information before it runs out versus when the air runs out, right? Because if you know the air's running out beforehand, what's that going to motivate you to do? Let's get the heck out of here and go find some oxygen. So that's where scarcity has fear built into it. That's why it's a powerful motivator. You can't separate the fear out, but it can be utilized in an ethical way, right? Mm-hmm. So ultimately leveraging that lever between the commitment principle and scarcity, now we've got two powerful things we can use to get people to move today, to create urgency and whatnot. And a simple way to be ethical here, like a lot of times you may see this in marketing, they'll say, hey, here's an offer and it's good for the first 4 people who respond. Right. So that's trying to leverage this competition aspect of scarcity. Not only do I not want it until I suddenly can't have it and it motivates me to want it more, but if I know somebody else is after the same thing as me at the same time, now I really want it because of that, right? So most people now have learned, well, are they really only give out 4 or are they going to give it to everybody, right? So they've learned kind of not to trust that scarcity aspect of it. But true ethical use of that scarcity is to be genuine and true. So if I say I'm only going to give out 4, we only give out 4.
Right. Yeah, that's a huge differentiation between, when I was thinking earlier about the difference between ethical persuasion and, I'm sure you hear this a lot, manipulation. How
Oh,
do
yeah.
you how do you differentiate between the two? And I think you just sort of hit it right there, where it's like you have to have honesty in what you're offering. You can still offer something and have that scarcity sort of mentality in it, but it has to be, backed up by honesty and integrity. I think that's a huge differentiation between ethical persuasion and manipulation, is the honest gain behind it. Because I'm sure in the Cialdini Institute, that's a very fine line, that people discuss a lot.
It is. Yeah. I mean, in fact, a lot of times I'll be talking to groups and even just hearing the word persuasion, it's for some people, it's got a negative connotation. They automatically lump it in with coercion, intimidation, force, manipulation, right?
Right.
Uh, Hierarchical authority, somebody over you in charge of you telling you what to do. Now, while it's true that those factors, manipulation, force, coercion, persuasion, even monetary incentives, right? Those are all under the category of influence, right? Influence is just about getting people to change their behavior, but it's a spectrum underneath influence, right? Persuasion being on the complete opposite end of the spectrum as coercion, manipulation, force, and telling people to do stuff. And really, at its core, what it comes down to is choice and control. Okay.
Right.
So, if somebody puts a gun to your head and says, do this or die, all right, you're going to do it. It'll influence you to change, right? But ultimately, when you don't feel like you had a real choice in the matter, when you didn't feel like you were in control, when the cat's away, the mice will play, right? You're not likely to continue the behavior. Okay?
Mhm.
Versus influence and persuasion on the other end of the spectrum is all about giving people choices. We're not forcing people to do anything. And it's all about them being in control.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah, it seems to be. I mean, as you're talking about this, you think about this when you're interpersonal relationships or platonic, whatever. You know, that sort of persuasion is a two-way street. Like the person who is receiving the information has to be in a space, it seems, to understand the difference between persuasion and manipulation and be open to receiving new information and taking it as growth and not and taking it as coercion. Because sometimes even for me, I'm like, is this person trying to manipulate me, or is he or she trying to help me grow?
Yeah.
So it's really up to the listener as well. It's a two-way street to how am I going to choose to intake this information? Am I going to intake it as am I in a space where I feel manipulated, or
Right.
or am I in a space and time and period in my life where I am here to grow? So it's a tricky line again, where it's that two-way street of where is this person at in their life too, which you seem to have no control over. I mean, maybe you can by the way you speak and the way you create a space for that person, but it's just it's the psychology of people too. And that can be very tricky as well, in being an effective communicator.
Definitely. Well, and I think it's like you said, people, as long as people are still interacting with each other, especially directly, for the most part, we're pretty good at sensing out or sussing out, is somebody really being honest and genuine, like you said?
Right.
Um, and that's one of our ethical principles, right? Is it true? Is what you're talking about absolutely true? So not the half truth, not kind of true, not sort of true, but true. Meaning, if I say I've only got 3 available, I don't have 6 in the closet ready
Mhm.
to go, kind of thing. So people gotta have pretty good guts and reactions and senses on those things. Um,
Right.
know that ideally, if you think about it from this standpoint, if you say yes to this person or no, what's going to happen, right? If I say yes to this person, is it really in both of our best interests ultimately to move forward together? Meaning we both win in some way, shape, or form. Sure, there may be some cost to both sides, but as long as we both have a net win, then it makes sense for us to do this, right? At the same time, objectively, if we get a no to the situation, do we both lose in some way, right?
Mhm.
And is there some cost to not doing business for both sides together? If you can answer yes to that one for yourself, then you can feel pretty good that probably the persuasion principles or whatever is present are being used in an ethical way uh, against you, so to speak, or in your favor.
Right. So pivoting to, Civil Talk is all about civility. And, civility really hinges on effective communication. So when you see someone with heightened emotions, what have you learned are some key persuasion principles that can help communicate ideas while maintaining that sort of empathy and respect and emotional intelligence?
Yeah, great question. I think ultimately with heightened emotions, if emotion is taking the ball and running with it, so to speak, and taking you to places you don't want it to go necessarily, the best way to bring it back is to stay focused, stay logical, and just present things back as a choice. Right.
Right.
In essence, well, sometimes when people get out of control emotionally, typically what I'm hearing is they feel out of control. Right. And they feel like they've lost that sense of choice in the matter. So putting them back in the driver's seat, so to speak, and giving them choices and giving them control again, a lot of times, if you ask the right question strategically, you can guide them back to the situation in a more normal conversation.
Yeah. I love that. You know, Thinking about just the gamut of people with emotional intelligence skills, do you think, people who naturally score higher on the emotional intelligence sort of skill are better at persuasion, or do you think this is a skill that anyone can learn?
Well, the good news is that because this stuff is based in science and there's research study after research study backing everything that we're talking about, everyone can learn to have more influence and persuasion, right? What we find oftentimes is those that have the higher emotional intelligence, those that tend to be the most natural communicators, those that are the best salespeople in the industry, right? What we've kind of learned is that they are all instinctively tapping into some of the principles, right?
Right.
At any given time. But because they're tapping into it and nobody else around them is, that's why they stand out, right? That's why they do better and show more success. But even for them, what I found oftentimes is they don't understand what they're doing. They don't know the method behind their madness, so to speak. There's no process. Like they don't, because they don't know the context of why what they did was successful. They're not consistent in doing it as well.
Right.
So what's cool about this is that even the best communicators can sharpen their knife, can learn to have more persuasion, because when they're more consistent in using these things, their results can go even higher, right? But of course, our most dramatic results come from those that are not naturally gifted in this stuff. And putting this into practice and over time, again, it's the practice of persuasion, not the perfection of persuasion. You can all learn to have a lot more influence in your life as a result.
Yeah, I think persuasion also involves a large deal of tact and knowing what to say and, more importantly, when to say it. Because if you're just persuading all the time, it seems really disingenuous. And these are really sort of, what's the word for it? Hard skills to teach someone. They're really. So with that being said, how can employees develop these skills, and how do you think, because Civil Talk works with college students and we work with colleges, um, how important do you think it is, this is a two-part question, how important do you think it is for faculty to develop these sorts of skills, like professors, to help students develop these skills as well, especially at a young age where these skills are just starting to form?
Yeah. Well, what we've kind of learned is that, human society wouldn't have even come together without these persuasion principles, right? They are at the core of why people even function in groups, number one. So as long as people are always still interacting with each other, there will always be a need to understand these principles to help influence people to move in a certain direction at the faculty level, at the student level. And what's crazy, we learn to trust these principles at a very early age, like, toddler ages, if you will, and beyond. So like I can think of my youngest son, for instance, By the time he was age 6, he had already instinctively tapped into and mastered 3 of the 6 principles of
Right.
persuasion. Okay.
Right.
So digging into those and learning them are key. The sooner the better. I mean, I can only imagine what else I could have achieved and accomplished had I understood these things earlier on in my career. So I'm a big fan of college students and other, even high school students, digging into these things because they're learning it as they speak. But you're in high school, right? And we're heavily influenced from social proof at that age, right? The evidence of what others are doing. They did a crazy study on smoking, and they said, what are the chances you'll be a smoker if one or both of your parents smoked? Okay.
Mhm.
Well, the percentage is not very high. Okay. 25% chance that you would be a smoker if one or both of your parents smoked.
Hmm.
But what are the chances you'd be a smoker if one of your or two of your friends smoked at that age?
Right.
Right. It's 1,000%.
Wow.
What if 3 or 4 of your friends smoked at that age? Right. It's like 2,400% chance you'll be a smoker.
Mhm.
So things like that, we learn these cues early on. And at that point, it will actually help them start making more rational connections to it. So they can see at that time, wait a minute, I feel the pull of what the crowd's doing because of the social proof evidence. But now it can come top of mind, rational thought, and go, but does that make sense for me?
Right.
So the whole reason Cialdini wrote the book Influence is he wrote it for us, the public, to teach us what many people are using to try to influence us, sometimes for our benefit, but sometimes just for theirs, right? So to use these things as knowledge and to better defend ourselves when
Right.
these things are present, and really to make that call, does this make sense for me?
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like what you're talking about. It's like anything, knowing your rights. The more you equip yourself with this sort of knowledge, the more you understand what you can do. It's the same thing like when you're on a debate team and you're sort of like figuring out what fallacies your opponent is saying. And it's so much easier to respond when you equip yourself with certain terminology. Um, so yeah, I mean, I asked that question because I think it's really important for professors and faculty to equip their students with this skill, especially when we're coming into an age where entrepreneurs are really growing in size and more college students are becoming interested in being entrepreneurs. And I think this is an important skill set to learn in a college atmosphere, because as you're saying, your peers are going to directly influence you. And if you're talking about this and this sort of topic is in the conversation with students, it's going to be so much more helpful. It's 2025 and we're starting new courses in colleges, and it's an exciting time really for college. This wasn't entrepreneur and business classes weren't available when I was in college, so it's really exciting to see and hear about this sort of at the forefront. I know Cialdini Institute has been around for a long time, but just because it's been around for a long time doesn't mean it's been in the forefront in discussion. There's been a lot of behind the scenes work, and there's been a lot of, so it's great to see, Cialdini Institute and CivilTalk coming together so we can sort of bridge these gaps and get this information out to people, especially young people. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about AI because, as time progresses, AI is here to stay. It's only going to expand in its capability. And as AI continues to shape that communication, do you see any risks in how artificial intelligence might be used to manipulate rather than ethically persuade?
Oh, big time. In fact, somebody just sent me a study that was done or released recently about how different programs like your Chat GPT and your Claudes and your whatever, your AI based programs, were tested to see would they attempt to scheme you into something
Right.
that you necessarily didn't want or need, so to speak. So trying to leverage the principles or whatnot in an unethical way to manipulate, coerce, scheme, and whatnot. And while some of them passed the tests, shockingly, most of them did not, and were all too easily willing to try to coerce you down a path that may not be in your best interest. At the same time, Dr. Cialdini is involved with a big study right now measuring, is AI susceptible? Could we change what that does based on these principles of persuasion? Right? Imagine, let's say it's our national defense and we built it as force field around our defense codes with an AI program. And what if you, with 3 questions that created some kind of commitment similar to what you were going to ask to give you the codes behind the force field, suddenly the AI opens up the kingdom and puts you at risk. Like, that's scary. Okay. Well, when a program has learned and been, number one, it's been programmed by people,
Right.
and it
Right.
studies people as the way it's learned, it's going to be susceptible to both sides of that coin, the good and the bad of using persuasion. So teaching AI ethically where these boundaries are so it doesn't get out of bounds has got to be at the forefront of these companies' purpose. Okay. Otherwise, like anything else, when the masses find your efforts to be unethical, you lose credibility and trust, and you will not be able to get that back from those people. They will find a different path.
Yeah. Yeah. In a sense, it's up to humanoids to find developers who have ethical understandings in their development of AI. It's a sort of stacked process where it's like we could either hire someone who doesn't understand these concepts, and that's why this conversation is so interesting, because it doesn't really just apply to entrepreneurs. It applies to anyone in any field, especially developers, especially people who are training programs to sort of speak for humans, you know. Um, so these concepts really apply to a variety of vocations. So you've trained under Dr. Robert Cialdini. So what is one lesson from him that completely changed the way you approach persuasion?
Ooh, that's a good one. Just one?
You can give two or three, totally fine.
Let me try. I'm trying to think what are some of the most powerful things. Well, number one is I've learned that not only what we say to people is important, but the order in which you say that to that person many times is even more important. Structure it and sequence it in one way, and you could actually influence more people to say no. Change the sequence, flip it a different way, and you can actually influence more people to say yes with no merit to what you're actually even talking about. It's just a consequence of the way our brain processes information and makes comparisons, which shapes our perspective. Okay. So that was kind of crazy that the order in which we say things often matters more. Right. I think a powerful one, and one that's really important in this day and age, is that, how do you build trust with people quickly? Because normally trust is built over multiple interactions over time, right? Well, in today's business and fast-paced world, we need to connect and get people to trust us today, right? Not 6 times from now, 6 months later. So what do we do with that? Well, what the research shows us under this authority principle to build trust with people, you be transparent, right? You don't, if there's something negative about what you're going to present to them, some elephant in the room you might want to hide otherwise, instead of hiding it, start with it. Tell them why they shouldn't buy it, and then go into why they should. Okay. Automatically presenting the negative with the pro of your case, so to speak, shows that you're trying to be transparent with them and instantly builds trust with people. Okay. So in this day and age where as you said, we're learning to distrust the technology and the messaging that AI is putting in front of us in every medium, right? Finding people that are transparent and things you can trust is going to be even more important.
Yeah, trust is huge. With that, what's a common mistake people make when trying to influence others, and how can they correct it?
Ooh, yeah. So a common mistake. Let me think. Oftentimes they may get some of the principles or portions of the principles confused For instance, I know with the reciprocity principle, reciprocity is all about if you give someone a gift of value, of significance, there's this obligation created inside of you where you feel the need to give back in kind, right? So if somebody gives you a gift on your birthday, you're probably going to give them a gift on their birthday. If they've done you a favor, you're probably going to do them a favor at some point, right? But confusing this idea of what a gift is with something else. So I've heard people recommend, oh, well, just make them an offer where if they come in, then you will give them something else, like a gift with purchase, if that makes sense. Okay. But and they think that's reciprocity. Well, yeah, you've given them a gift, or at least you've called it a gift, but it's not really a gift by definition, right? A gift is given on the front end with no real expectation for anything in return. But a reward or an incentive is given after the fact. It's very conditional. If you do this, then you get this, right? So that's not what reciprocity is about. It's not about giving rewards. It's about giving gifts of value and significance. So confusing some of the little nuances of the principles, right? And then going down the wrong path, and they're actually using things that don't have any influence and then wonder why they're not getting the result.
Right. Yeah, it's a really important distinction. So how can individuals apply persuasion techniques in their daily lives, not just in business, but in relationships, negotiations, or even day-to-day parenting?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about this is that what Daniel Kahneman and others have done in their research and studies, in addition to Cialdini, is that most of our decisions happen at the subconscious level. Okay. It takes way too much energy to get to the rational thought centers of the brain. And the energy burned and expended because of that means that there's no way we can invest that kind of energy on every decision that we have to make. It's impossible. Okay. It'd be exhausting. Think of all the things you're bombarded with from social media and everything else. Think of all the decisions you have to make on a daily basis at work, at home, etc. It's impossible, right? So most of what we use to make decisions is below the surface. Well, that's where these principles live, okay? So number one, understanding these principles helps you in that realm. You have to understand them. Number two, I would say, is because of that, you have to get good. And at that point, understanding when you're talking to somebody in a situation, being the detective, pulling to the surface and analyzing and going, wait, what principle is here in this moment that I can actually tap into? Because the good news is when you're interacting with other people, there's always at least one of the persuasion principles there you can tap into. If you're lucky, there's multiple principles there, just organically, naturally there to the situation that you can tap into. Your challenge is figuring out which ones. And most of the people haven't been trained to recognize what the principles are present, right? The second thing is now that we've recognized it, get some training on what do I do with it? How do I tap into this in an ethical way for the best possible outcome for me and the other person involved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what would be, upon closing reflection, what would be one of those components, like if you could leave our audience with just one component, one ethical persuasion component or a key insight to create a more civil interaction with another human being, what would it be?
You know what? I'd say probably the most overlooked or bungled principle, we like to say, is the principle of liking. Okay. And liking is a fairly simple principle. We like to do business with people we like, but liking is not about getting the other person to like you directly, right? It's about you being the one to show them that you like them first. Okay. When you show them that you like them first, the natural consequence is they tend to reciprocate and they like you back. Okay? Mm-hmm. So figuring out things you can do to show them that you like them, number one is you find a connection with them. Mm-hmm. If you want to be civil with people, you got to have connections. Okay. If there's no bridge between us, then we're potentially enemies. But if there is a bridge or connection between us, well, we can be more civil, right? We can have better conversations. We can find more paths to work together as a result. So leveraging this idea of liking and kind of making sure that you're bringing the humanity into the application at hand. So with digital technology and AI and your websites and everything else, we've kind of lost the humanity in there, right? Like your standard signature line in an email, right, is just a typed font. Did that come from a person or did it come from a program? I don't know, right? Versus if it had a picture of you on there, if it had like your digital signature on there, like your real signature that you've scanned, that reminds the person reading that email that, hey, yeah, this is coming from a real person, right? Bringing the humanity back into that. So if we can focus on the liking aspect and finding these commonalities, showing people that we like them, reminding them of technology and that effort and try to bring the humanity back into it, that's going to be our best opportunities to be civil.
Yeah, I really love that answer. It reminds me of, when you're really trying to get someone to like you. First of all, it's like a fun competition you can have with yourself. Like, I'm going to get you to like me first before, the other way around, which I think is really fun. But even, when you're talking about an email, it's so easy to just take 2 seconds and say, I hope you're having a great Thursday. Or if continue a discussion from a previous time, like, how is your daughter? I hope your daughter is doing okay. I hope your dog is doing okay. Little things like that I have learned and has gone a long way. And it ties into what you're talking about with just kindness and staying curious. I think staying curious is really important. It goes such a long way in a very subconscious way. With ethical persuasion, getting people to like you, if that's your goal, hopefully that's your goal.
Yeah. And I love what you said there, and you're dead on. Somebody said this to me recently, and I just loved it. I'm not sure where it came from, but they said, be more interested than interesting.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Showing that curiosity for others, right, is huge.
Right.
Versus trying to be interesting to them and getting them to like you, as you said.
Yeah.
You be the first to be interested. You be interested in them, okay, and you'll get a much better result.
Yeah. Yeah. Not to say that you shouldn't talk about yourself in a discussion, but I agree, it's 60 to 70% about them, 30, 40% about you. You can always tie it back to you, but yeah, I agree. And, we live with ourselves day in and day out. I'm sick of me sometimes. I'm just like,
yeah.
I don't want to talk about myself. I'm so sick of myself in a very healthy way. I want to hear about other people and their lives and what they're doing, but also I think, that also taps into having a certain degree of self-awareness. You have to question yourself a lot. And once that happens to an nth degree, you're just like, okay, I'm over it. But are there any last words you want to say to our listeners, how they can be involved in the Cialdini Institute and in your work?
Yeah, well, obviously, feel free to reach out. You can reach me at Chris, CHRIS, at Cialdini.com. We have all kinds of online on-demand training programs to help take you deeper than what the book, Influence the Psychology of Persuasion, started. That was just scratching the surface. There's so much deeper depths you can go to. We have application programs because, again, people may have the knowledge of these things, but they may be stuck on, what do I do with them, as we talked about, right? How do I put these two things in a strategy to get better commitments or whatnot? So we have some exciting programs coming up with that. And for those that really see the value of what we're presenting, especially faculty in schools and whatnot, and want to integrate this into their programming, hey, we're looking for people to train, right? To be our trainers, so to speak, to help us spread this message to the masses and continue to reinforce Dr. Cialdini's legacy. I mean, the book is 40 years old and it's never been more prevalent and relevant than it is today, right? And as long as people interact with each other, that's never going away. So we need help to spread the word on these things and educate as many people as possible to not only be able to defend themselves, number one, but also to be able to leverage these things ethically so everybody wins in that scenario.
Yep, exactly. Right. You got it. It's going to continue to stay relevant until humans have emotions, and feelings and desires, So thank you, Christopher, or Dr. Christopher Phelps, for being here with us today. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, listeners, for tuning into this episode of the CivilTalk Podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with Dr. Christopher Phelps. If today's discussion resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode, and make sure to check out our website at www.civiltalk.com to stay up to date on upcoming episodes like this one and further resources. Until next time, remember, stay kind, stay curious, and we'll see you on the next episode of the CivilTalk Podcast.